The restaurant was one of those upscale places where silence felt expensive, where every clink of crystal seemed choreographed. Major Daniel Kovac sat alone at a corner table, checking his watch for the fourth time in 10 minutes. The reservation was for 7. It was now 7:45. His dress uniform felt suddenly too tight around the collar, and he wondered, not for the first time, why he'd let his squadron commander talk him into this blind date setup. 4 deployments, 3 combat zones, and countless close air support missions hadn't prepared him for whatever this awkward evening was becoming. The waiter passed by again with that polite, pitying smile that people reserve for the obviously stood up. Daniel reached for his water glass, considering whether to just pay for the untouched bread basket and leave with whatever dignity remained. That's when he heard them. 4 distinct voices, young and urgent, tumbling through the restaurant's front entrance like a small, chaotic squadron breaching enemy airspace. He turned, more from instinct than curiosity, and saw them 4 children ranging from maybe 6 to 12, scanning the dining room with tactical precision that would have impressed his flight instructor. The oldest, a girl with dark braids and fierce eyes, locked onto him first. She pointed. They approached in formation. "Are you Major Kovac?" the girl asked, slightly breathless. "Our mommy's sorry she's late." The other 3 nodded in unison, a boy with glasses, twin girls who couldn't have been more than 7. Daniel blinked, his combat-trained mind struggling to process this particular tactical situation. Before he could answer, the boy added, "She said to tell you she's coming from the base. There was an emergency scramble. She'll be here in 20 minutes." The twins watched him with identical expressions of hope mixed with worry, as if they'd delivered this message before to people who didn't wait. Daniel looked at these 4 kids standing at attention beside his table, their shoes scuffed, their clothes mismatched like they'd dressed themselves in a hurry. Something in their eyes, something familiar, made him gesture to the empty chairs. "Well," he said slowly, "I guess we should order some appetizers while we wait." The relief that washed over their faces was immediate and profound. The oldest girl slid into the seat across from him, and the others followed. "I'm Alexis," she said, extending her hand with unexpected formality. "That's Marcus, and those are Riley and Reagan." Daniel shook her hand, feeling the calluses that seemed wrong for a 12-year-old. "Your mom," he ventured carefully. "She's a pilot." Alexis nodded, something complicated crossing her expression. "She flies A-10 Warthogs, best in her squadron, even though nobody believed it at first." The cold January rain hammered against the restaurant windows as Daniel studied these 4 children who just upended his evening. Marcus adjusted his glasses and pulled out a small notebook, flipping through pages covered in what looked like aircraft specifications and tactical diagrams. "Mom doesn't usually do blind dates," he offered, his voice carrying that particular tone of a kid who's learned to be the adult in situations. "Uncle Harris basically ordered her to come." Daniel recognized the name Colonel James Harris, wing commander at Bagram before transferring stateside. The twins, Riley and Reagan, had started coloring on the paper placemats with crayons they'd apparently brought with them, drawing what were unmistakably A-10 Thunderbolts with surprising accuracy for 7-year-olds. "How long has your mom been flying?" Daniel asked, accepting a breadstick from Alexis, who'd taken it upon herself to distribute them like ammunition. 8 years, she answered, "but she's been in longer. She was ground crew first, worked her way up. Dad didn't approve. He left when Reagan and Riley were bobbies." The casual way she delivered this information suggested a story told and retold, processed and packed away. Marcus looked up from his notebook. "She's call sign Widow. Not because of Dad, he's not dead, just gone. It's because of what she does to enemy armor." Daniel felt something shift in his chest, a recognition he couldn't quite name. Before he could respond, his phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "This is Captain Reina Salazar. My kids found you. I'm 10 minutes out. If you've already left, I understand. If you're still there, thank you." He typed back quickly, "Still here. Your advanced team secured the perimeter." 3 dots appeared then. "They're the best wingmen I've got." The children had relaxed now, the initial mission completed. Riley started explaining her drawing. This is Mommy's plane. It goes BRRRRT while Reagan demonstrated the sound with impressive volume. Marcus showed Daniel a page in his notebook detailing the GAU-8 Avenger cannon specifications. Alexis watched him carefully, still evaluating, still protective. Most people don't wait, she said quietly, almost to herself. When Mom's late, when there's a scramble, when duty calls. They don't wait. Daniel met her eyes, saw the weight she carried. I've been late to things for the same reasons, he told her. I understand how it works. The restaurant had grown busier, the ambient noise of conversations and clinking silverware creating a buffer around their table. The door opened again at 8:05, bringing with it a gust of cold air and the scent of rain and jet fuel. Daniel saw her before the kids did. A woman in a flight suit, her hair still compressed from a helmet, exhaustion and determination carved into her posture. She was scanning the restaurant with the same tactical awareness her children had displayed, and when her eyes found their table, the relief was visceral. Captain Reina Salazar wasn't what Daniel had expected, though he wasn't entirely sure what he'd been expecting. She moved through the restaurant like someone used to navigating tight spaces at speed, apologizing quietly to a waiter she nearly collided with, her attention fixed on the corner table where her children sat with a stranger in dress uniform. Mommy, the twins spotted her simultaneously, starting to rise, but Alexis put a hand on each of their shoulders, gentle but firm. Reina reached the table and Daniel stood reflexively. Up close, he could see the stressed lines around her eyes, the shadow of dried sweat at her temples, the way her hands trembled slightly from what he recognized as post-flight adrenaline crash. Major Kovac, she said, her voice rough, I am so sorry. I was on standby and… Captain Salazar, he interrupted gently, your children already briefed me. Please sit. For a moment she just looked at him, then at her kids, then back at him. Something uncertain flickered across her face before she slid into the chair the twins had saved for her. Marcus immediately poured her a glass of water. Alexis pushed the bread basket toward her. Emergency scramble, Daniel asked. Reina nodded, drinking half the water in one pull. False alarm, ultimately. Radar ghost. But we were wheels up for 90 minutes. She looked at her children, doing a quick visual assessment that Daniel recognized, checking for signs of stress, fear, abandonment. I'm sorry you guys had to. We handled it, Alexis said firmly. Major Kovac waited. Reina's eyes met his across the table, and in them Daniel saw something he understood intimately. The exhaustion of balancing two lives, the guilt of never being able to give either one full attention, the weight of always being on call. Thank you, she said, and the words carried more freight than simple gratitude. The waiter appeared, mercifully tactful, taking their orders. The kids knew what they wanted without looking at menus, a routine well established. Reina ordered the cheapest entree, a habit Daniel recognized from his own single-parent deployments with his nephew. Through the meal, Daniel watched Reina navigate her dual role with practiced efficiency. She'd listened to Marcus explain his latest aviation research with genuine interest, redirect the twins when they got too loud, check in with Alexis, who remained watchful and protective. But beneath it all, he could see her struggling to shift gears, to transition from combat-ready pilot to present mother. Her hands would still occasionally shake, and she'd absently touch her left thigh where the torque of the flight stick would have stressed the muscles during aggressive maneuvering. The kids said you're the best in your squadron, Daniel ventured during a lull when the children were occupied with their food. Reina smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. The kids are biased. I'm competent. I get the job done. The deflection was automatic, well practiced. That's not what I heard, he pressed gently. Colonel Harris speaks highly of your capabilities. She looked at him sharply, reassessing. You know Harris, Daniel nodded. We flew together in Afghanistan. Different airframes, but same battle space. He mentioned he had a Hawk driver who could put ordnance through a window at 4,000 feet in a 40-knot crosswind. Reina's expression shifted, something defensive dropping away. Harris talks too much. But there was warmth there now, recognition of a shared language. Marcus perked up. Did you really fly in Afghanistan, sir? The conversation shifted then, the children drawing Daniel into their world with questions about missions and aircraft and what it was like. Raina watched, her posture gradually relaxing, though her eyes never stopped moving, checking exits, tracking servers, maintaining situational awareness even here. When dessert came, the twins had insisted on sharing a chocolate lava cake. Alexis leaned toward her mother and whispered something Daniel couldn't hear. Raina's hand found her daughter's, squeezed gently. "I know, baby. Thank you for taking care of things." The girl nodded, satisfied, and returned to helping her sisters with their dessert. Daniel saw the exchange, understood it. Alexis wasn't just the oldest. She was the backup commander, the one who held the line when her mother had to fly. The rain had stopped by the time they finished, leaving the streets glossy and reflective under the streetlights. The restaurant had emptied somewhat, the late dinner crowd thinning. Raina insisted on paying her half despite Daniel's protests, and he didn't push it because he understood pride. Outside, the January air was crisp and clean, washed fresh by the rain. The children clustered around Raina's battered Honda Pilot, and vehicle that had clearly seen better days. Marcus opened the door for his sisters with a gallantry that seemed learned from necessity rather than instruction. Alexis hung back, watching Daniel with those evaluating eyes. "Are you going to ask her out again?" she asked bluntly. Raina, halfway through buckling Reagan's seatbelt, froze. Daniel looked at this 12-year-old guardian, this fierce protector, and answered honestly, "I'd like to, if she'd like that too." Alexis considered this, then nodded once, decisive. "Okay, but if you're going to be around, you should know we come as a package. She doesn't do anything halfway." Daniel smiled. "Neither do I." The girl studied him a moment longer, then seemed to reach some internal conclusion. She extended her hand again, formal and serious. "Then welcome aboard, Major." He shook her hand, feeling the weight of the trust being tentatively offered. Raina had finished with the twins and was now standing beside her daughter, her expression carefully neutral but her eyes uncertain. "Alexis, get in the car, please," she said softly. The girl obeyed, but not without a final glance that clearly communicated she'd be watching. When the door closed, Raina turned to Daniel. "I'm sorry about that. She's protective." Daniel shook his head. "She's remarkable. They all are." Raina's eyes softened. "They've had to be. This life, it's not easy for them." "I know," Daniel said. "My sister died when my nephew was 6. I raised him while flying missions. I know what it costs." Something in Raina's face shifted, a recognition of shared experience. "Then you understand why I don't usually do this. Dadding, putting them through, meeting people who might not stay." Daniel looked at the Honda, at the 4 faces pressed against the windows watching them. "I understand why it matters to get it right." They stood in the parking lot, 2 pilots who'd learned to navigate far more complicated airspace than romance, both carrying damage, both still flying. "Can I call you?" Daniel asked. "When you're not on standby." Raina smiled, genuine this time. "I'd like that." She pulled out her phone, they exchanged numbers. 3 weeks later, Daniel found himself at a different restaurant, this time with all 5 Salazars and his nephew Jake. A gangly 15-year-old who'd initially been skeptical, but was now deep in conversation with Marcus about flight simulator strategies. The twins had declared Jake their new favorite person after he'd shown them videos of his robotics team competition. Alexis was still watchful, still protective, but she'd started to relax around him in increments. Raina sat beside Daniel, close enough that their shoulders touched, and when her phone buzzed with a standby alert, her hand found his under the table, apology and promise combined. "I have to go," she said quietly. The table went still, the children's expressions shifting into practiced resignation. But this time Daniel squeezed her hand back. "We'll wait here. Have Jake's phone call me when your wheel's down and we'll order dessert then." Raina's eyes widened slightly. "You don't have to." "We're waiting," Alexis interrupted, her voice firm. "Right, Major Kovac," Daniel nodded. "Right, we'll hold the perimeter." Raina looked around the table at her children, at Jake, who was nodding supportive agreement, at Daniel, whose presence promised something she'd stopped believing in, someone who stayed. She stood, kissed each of her children's heads, squeezed Daniel's shoulder, and left at a controlled run that betrayed her urgency. The waiting room of military life was familiar to all of them, Marcus pulled out his homework. The twins started another drawing. Alexis watched her siblings, then looked at Daniel. "Thank you," she said simply. He understood what she meant, not just for waiting but for seeing them, for understanding the equation of their lives. "Always," he answered and meant it. Raina was wheels down 90 minutes later. By the time she returned to the restaurant, still in her flight suit, the table had transformed into a study session/art project, with Jake helping Marcus with algebra while the twins decorated the tablecloth with crayons the sympathetic waiter had provided. She stood at the entrance for a moment, taking in the scene, and Daniel saw the exact moment something in her chest unclenched a tension she'd carried so long she probably didn't even notice it anymore. When she reached the table, the twins launched into an explanation of their drawings. Marcus showed her his completed homework. Alexis just smiled. Daniel stood, pulled out her chair, and when she sat, bone-tired and running on empty, she leaned into him for just a moment. "You stayed," she whispered. "I stayed," he confirmed. They ordered dessert, and the twins insisted Raina try their chocolate mousse, and somewhere between the laughter and the sugar crash, Daniel felt the shape of something he'd thought he'd lost after his sister died: the possibility of family. The months that followed established a rhythm. Daniel learned to read the alert patterns, to distinguish between routine standby and genuine scrambles. He learned that Alexis needed reassurance through action, not words, that Marcus processed stress through research, that the twins needed physical affection and silly voices, that Raina carried guilt like a second flight suit, wearing it constantly even when it didn't fit. He was there on the night Raina got called up at 2 a.m., and Alexis appeared at his door 30 minutes later with her siblings in tow, rain-soaked and scared because their backup sitter had canceled. He made hot chocolate, set up the guest room, and stayed awake until Raina returned at dawn, finding her children asleep in a nest of blankets while he dozed in the chair keeping watch. She'd stood in the doorway of his living room, and he'd seen her face work through a dozen emotions before settling on something that looked like hope. "I can't ask you to keep doing this," she'd said. "You're not asking," he'd replied. "I'm choosing." That was the moment, he thought later, when they stopped dancing around possibility and started building toward certainty. The squadron noticed, of course. Military communities were small and word traveled. Some of the older pilots gave Daniel knowing looks. A few offered quiet approval. Others, the ones who'd never quite believed a woman belonged in an A-10 cockpit, made their skepticism known in the ways people do when they think they're being subtle. Raina bore it with the same stoic competence she brought to everything, but Daniel saw how it wore on her. It came to a head 6 months into their relationship, at a squadron barbecue where children ran wild and beer flowed freely. Daniel was flipping burgers when he heard it. Captain Rick Darnell, a legacy pilot whose father and grandfather had both flown, holding court near the coolers. "I'm just saying, Salazar's solid enough, but she's spread too thin. 4 kids, single mom trying to keep up with quals. Something's got to give. Usually does with the women pilots." Several people shifted uncomfortably, but no one contradicted him. Daniel set down the spatula carefully, aware of Raina across the yard helping Reagan with a kite, unaware of the conversation. He walked over to Darnell's group, his expression neutral but his eyes cold. "Captain," he said quietly, "I've read Salazar's after-action reports. Her precision strike record is cleaner than anyone else in the squadron, including yours. Her maintenance logs show better pre-flight discipline. Her flight hours exceed requirements by 40%. So I'm curious what metric you're using to measure keeping up." Darnell bristled. "I'm talking about focus, commitment." "She's more committed than most people I've flown with," Daniel interrupted, his voice still quiet but carrying steel. "She just has to be committed to more than one thing. That doesn't make her weak. It makes her efficient." He held Darnell's gaze until the other man looked away, muttering something about not meaning offense. Daniel returned to his burgers, aware that the conversation around the coolers had gone silent. Raina found him later, after the kids had exhausted themselves and were collapsed in various shaded spots like casualties from a sugar-based offensive. "Harris told me what you said to Darnell," she said, not quite looking at him. "You didn't have to do that." Daniel flipped a burger, considering his words. "I didn't do it for you," he said finally. "I did it because he was wrong and wrong needed correcting." Raina was quiet for a moment, watching the smoke rise from the grill. "People have been saying versions of that since I pinned on Wings. That I'm not focused enough, not committed enough, that the kids are a distraction." "Are they?" Daniel asked, meeting her eyes. She smiled, tired but genuine. "They're the reason I fly so carefully, the reason I come home. Darnell sees them as a weakness. I see them as the mission worth protecting." Daniel reached out, took her hand. "Then Darnell's a fool." She squeezed his fingers and they stood together in comfortable silence, watching her children sleep in the shade, small and vulnerable and completely unaware of the battles fought daily on their behalf. The proposal happened on a Tuesday, which seemed appropriate for a relationship built on the practical rather than the romantic. They were in Raina's kitchen, the kids at school, her rare day off coinciding with his leave. She was making coffee, he was reviewing mission reports, and somewhere between the second cup and the third page, he looked up and said, "We should get married." Raina nearly dropped the coffee pot. "What?" Daniel set down the report. "We should get married, we're good together. The kids are good with this. Jake loves your kids, I love your kids, I love you. It makes sense tactically and strategically." It was possibly the least romantic proposal in history, and Raina stared at him like he just suggested they steal a fighter jet. "Daniel, I know it's fast," he continued, "and I know you've got reasons to be careful, but I'm not going anywhere. I'm in this. All of it. So we can keep doing this dance where we pretend we're just dating, or we can acknowledge what this actually is." Raina set down the coffee pot, her hands shaking. "You're serious?" "Completely." She looked at him, this man who'd waited in restaurants, who'd taken midnight calls from frightened children, who defended her to people who'd never believed she needed defending. "I have 4 kids," she said, testing. "I know. I'm prepared to have 4 kids. I'm on call constantly." "I know, so am I. I'm terrible at romance." "I've noticed I don't care," Raina laughed, a sound caught between tears and disbelief. "This is insane." Daniel stood, crossed to where she stood by the counter, took her trembling hands in his. "This is the sanest thing I've done in years. Yes or no, Raina?" She looked up at him, this competent, damaged, fierce woman who'd learned to fly because someone told her she couldn't, who'd raised 4 children in the margins of a military career, who'd stopped believing anyone would choose her chaos. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, you insane man, yes." They told the kids that evening, gathered in the living room with the kind of serious energy usually reserved for PCS orders or failed report cards. Alexis went still, her expression unreadable. Marcus looked between them rapidly, processing. The twins just looked confused. "We're getting married?" Riley asked. "Like married married." "Married married," Raina confirmed. "Which means Major Kavak Daniel will be living with us. He'll be part of our family officially." The silence stretched. Daniel felt his heart hammering, suddenly aware that he just proposed adopting 4 children who'd been abandoned by one father already, who had every reason to reject another man trying to insert himself into their lives. Alexis spoke first. "Do we get to call you Dad?" The question was careful, testing boundaries. Daniel looked at Raina, who nodded slightly, then back at Alexis. "If you want to, no pressure, I know that word is complicated." The girl considered this, her fierce protector's eyes evaluating one last time. Then, decisively, "Okay, when's the wedding?" The twins erupted in questions about dresses and flowers. Marcus wanted to know the logistical timeline. And just like that, the decision was made, absorbed into the family unit with the same practical efficiency they brought to everything else. Later, after the kids were in bed and the house had finally settled into quiet, Raina found Daniel on the back porch, staring at the stars. She sat beside him, close enough that their shoulders touched. "Thank you," she said softly, "for choosing all of us." Daniel turned to her, this woman who'd become his whole world without him quite noticing when it happened. "Thank you for letting me." They sat in comfortable silence, two damaged people who'd found each other in the chaos, and above them the stars burned cold and distant, indifferent witnesses to the small, fierce love being built below. The wedding was small, held at the base chapel with squadron members filling the pews. Alexis was maid of honor, fierce in her first formal dress. Marcus walked Reyna down the aisle with a solemnity that made several people tear up. The twins were flower girls who took their job devastatingly seriously. Jake stood as Daniel's best man, wearing his dress uniform with pride. When the chaplain asked if anyone objected, the silence was absolute and supportive. When Daniel and Reyna exchanged vows, simple, practical promises about staying and choosing and fighting for this, there wasn't a dry eye in the chapel. And when they were pronounced married, the squadron erupted in applause that echoed off the walls like thunder. The reception was held in the squadron hangar, decorated with white lights and streamers that the kids had helped hang. Someone had parked Reyna's A10 number 447, Widow's Wrath, stenciled on the nose at the far end, polished to perfection. The twins insisted on taking pictures in front of it, and Daniel lifted them into the cockpit one by one while Reyna explained the instruments. Alexis stood back, watching, and when Daniel caught her eye, she smiled, genuine and unguarded for maybe the first time since they'd met. The first dance was interrupted 3 times by the twins cutting in, which made everyone laugh and seemed entirely appropriate. Marcus gave a speech that quoted Sun Tzu and made oddly perfect sense. Jake talked about family being the people who showed up, not just the ones you were born to. And Alexis, when called upon unexpectedly by the DJ, simply raised her glass and said, "To my mom, the best pilot I know, and to Daniel, who was smart enough to see that. Welcome to the squadron, Dad." The hangar erupted in cheers, glasses raised, and Daniel felt something break open in his chest, a door he'd kept sealed since his sister's death, finally opening to let light back in. Reyna leaned into him, her hand finding his, and whispered, "We did it. We actually did it." He kissed her temple. "We're just getting started." That night, after the reception ended and the kids were asleep at Harris's house for the wedding night, Daniel and Reyna stood in front of 447, alone in the quiet hangar. The A-10 loomed above them, ugly and beautiful and brutally efficient. "You know," Daniel said, running his hand along the fuselage, "I used to think these things were the toughest aircraft in the inventory." Reyna smiled. "Used to?" He turned to her, this woman who'd survived abandonment and skepticism and the daily grind of balancing impossible demands. "Now I know they're only the second toughest thing flying." She laughed, the sound echoing in the empty hangar. "Flattery will get you everywhere, Major Kovac." "That's the plan, Captain Kovac," he replied, and pulled her close. They stood together in the shadow of her warbird, 2 pilots who'd found their way through different storms to the same landing zone, and began the next phase of their mission, building the family neither had thought possible. The years that followed were not easy, but they were good. There were missed dinners and emergency scrambles and nights when both of them were exhausted and short-tempered. There were tears and arguments and moments of doubt. But there were also soccer games where they both showed up, their kids' faces lighting up to see them both in the stands. There were homework sessions that turned into family debates about aerodynamics. There were quiet mornings when Daniel would wake to find all 4 kids piled into their bed, seeking comfort from nightmares or simply wanting closeness. Alexis graduated high school with honors and a full ROTC scholarship, declaring her intention to fly like her mother. Marcus earned a spot at MIT studying aerospace engineering. The twins grew into fierce, brilliant teenagers who kept everyone on their toes. And through it all, Daniel and Reyna flew their respective missions, came home to each other, and built something neither had thought they deserved, a family that stayed. On their 5th anniversary, Reyna made captain and was offered a squadron command position. On their 7th, Daniel was promoted to lieutenant colonel. They navigated deployments and TDYs, video calls from opposite sides of the world, and the constant juggling act of 2 military careers and 4 children who needed them both. But they navigated it together, and that made all the difference. The moment Daniel understood the full weight of what they'd built came on an ordinary Thursday. He was home with the twins, now 14, while Raina was on a training mission. The call came at 1600 hours. Aircraft malfunction, emergency landing, crew safe but Raina in the hospital with a concussion and fractured wrist. His hands shook as he corralled the twins, called Alexis, now a second lieutenant herself, and Marcus, and drove to the base hospital with his heart in his throat. He found her in a recovery room, looking small and battered but alive. Relief hit him so hard he had to sit down. Raina reached for him with her good hand, and he took it, pressing his forehead against hers. "I'm okay," she whispered. "I'm okay." The twins burst in then, followed by their older siblings, and the room filled with the chaotic energy of a family reuniting after fear. And Daniel understood this was what they'd been building toward all along. Not perfect, not easy, but real and lasting, and worth every difficult moment. Later, after the kids had been reassured and sent to get cafeteria food, Raina looked at him with exhausted eyes. "Still think marrying into this chaos was a good idea?" Daniel kissed her knuckles carefully, mindful of the IV. "Best tactical decision I ever made," she smiled. "Even with all the emergencies and deployments and crazy." "Especially with all that," he said firmly. "That's the mission. That's always been the mission." Raina's eyes filled with tears. "I love you, Daniel Kovac." "I love you, Raina Kovac. Now rest. I've got the perimeter." She closed her eyes, trusting him to keep watch, and he settled into the uncomfortable hospital chair, prepared to hold the line for as long as she needed. Because that's what family did. That's what they'd promised each other in a base chapel 5 years ago. That's what they'd keep doing until the last bird landed and the mission was complete. Outside the hospital window, the sun was setting over the flight line, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. Somewhere on that tarmac, 447 sat waiting for its pilot to heal and return. And in this small room, surrounded by the evidence of a life fully lived, family photos on phones, kids' voices echoing from the cafeteria, the steady beep of monitors confirming survival, Daniel Kovac understood what real victory looked like. It wasn't medals or promotions or perfect mission records. It was this: choosing to show up, to stay, to build something lasting with someone brave enough to let you try. It was 4 kids who'd learned to trust again. It was a woman who'd been told she couldn't and did it anyway. It was a blind date that had been 45 minutes late and worth every second of waiting. It was family.